reason I was shaking my head so vigorously when Karen was talking about Cheryl's chocolate pie is because I love it so much. Every time I go to that establishment and I eat it, in between forkfuls, as I'm spooning it into my mouth, I recite the various ways that I love that chocolate pie. And my partner gets really annoyed with me, so he usually makes me take it to go. Thank you all for coming. Karen, thank you, and your staff. I want to thank Samantha Bellinger for putting this symposium together, Chloe Vogt, her assistant. I wanted to thank our roster of all-star speakers today. Your work has been very instrumental in the research that we conducted for Sweet Tooth. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, Lake Champlain Chocolate. They have been very generous in supporting the exhibition, both monetarily and in kind with chocolate, and we're very appreciative. This exhibition really started out as, the idea of it started out, I was thinking about a show called Food for Thought, and I wanted to talk about food and advocacy and the way that art and design are being used to promote these ideas. And then I got distracted, as I often do, and I started thinking about the fork, and I wanted to do a whole exhibition on the fork. And then my brilliant assistant curator, Carolyn Bauer, out there, and I decided that may be too specific, and a niche area for people. So she and I came up with this idea of looking at sweets and desserts. And it's a natural fit for the institution when you think about the founding of Shelburne Museum. Electra Havemeyer-Webb, our founder, she was the daughter of H.O. Havemeyer, who basically ran a monopoly on sugar in the late 19th and early part of the 20th century. He was variously known as the Sugar King and as the Sugar Pope. We have an amazing illustration in our collection that shows him alongside other kind of robber barons and their various guises of their the sources of their largesse. And they have H.O. With the cone-shaped sugar outfit, and he's the Sugar Pope. And it's just, I wanted to include that in the show, but we decided not to. The family, by the way, was all excited about it, and they have a very good sense of humor about these things. So we wanted to think about sugar in terms of the founding of our institution, but also the way sugar affects not only our culture, but our waistlines. And so we organized this exhibition in a way that audiences come into it with their own perspectives, and they can encounter the works in the way that they choose to. If you come in and you just want to see pretty poppy pictures of candy or cake, or if you want to take the time and you want to delve into the little labels, you get to read a little bit further into kind of the social issues that surround sugar and chocolate. So the exhibitions like these are only able to provide our audiences with just a morsel, a sampling, really, of the intellectual content that surrounds these subjects. And so that's why I enjoy and appreciate events like this that allow our audiences to take a bigger bite and really kind of explore the subject for themselves and listen to experts in their own right. So the way that things are going to go today is that I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then once the speakers are done, we'll have a little bit of a Q&A period where people can ask them questions, and we'll just move on periodically that way. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our first speaker, whose work was very important in the research of this exhibition. Andrew F. Smith is the author or editor of 32 books and encyclopedias, including the award-winning Oxford Encyclopedia of Food and Drink in America, Sugar, A Global History, and the 3-volume Food in America. He teaches in the Food Studies Department at the New School in Manhattan, my alma mater, and is the editor of the Edible Series and Food Controversy Series for Reaction, books in London. He has been regularly interviewed on radio and television, including National Public Radio, the History Channel, and lost my place, and the Food Network. He has served as a historical consultant to several television series, including PBS, What We Eat, and History Detectives, and Food Network's Heavyweights, the History Channel's America Eats, Discoveries, How Stuff is Made, and the National Geographic Channel's 6-episode miniseries, Eat, the Story of Food. I don't know how you can conduct that much research and be as thin as he is. Andrew, please, I'll give you the podium.
I wanted to go to the dark side, but I guess I can't now. In any case, I got this grant, and I put a chocolate bar with almonds in it in the middle of a map of the world, and I put on it a little off to the side some teacher advice, or kids could go up on their own and take a look at this. We had little lines going from places to places and say, where does chocolate come from? And I had a little line, in this case, from the chocolate bar all the way to West Africa, and where does sugar come from? And I had this going to, at that time, Cuba. It changed later on, but all sorts of different places in the world, and I enjoyed putting that together very much. It was probably one of the most successful things that I ever did. UNICEF loved it, and they published it in 15, 20 different languages, and it went up in school around the world on the wall. So I thought that was an interesting sort of thing to do. The Swedes bitterly complained that I was promoting junk food, a topic which I had never heard prior to that time. So it shows you my own ignorance on this. They decided they would use the idea. They put a bicycle down there, and they said, well, where does rubber come from, and where does steel come from? A lot of it comes from Sweden, by the way. I thought I'd point this out. And so you had these interconnections that were going on. Because that was successful, I was invited to 10 conferences, and usually it was for a lunch or for a dinner, and they would say, could you now do the food thing for us? And so I became the food person, even though it was not my academic background and not a particular strength that I had. And I started looking at this and saying, okay, this was interesting. I could talk to adults about virtually anything that I wanted to talk about as long as I got their attention. So if I wanted to talk about politics, I could talk about food. If I wanted to talk about economics, I could talk about food. If I wanted to get them interested in social and cultural matters, I could talk about food. And in my case, I loved history. Anybody not love history in here? Not love history? Corey, okay, no, all right, no problem in this case. I decided that if you took a look at sugar's history, in this case, sucrose, you would have a history of the world. And so I began to write a 3-volume work on the history of sugar. And it starts off in New Guinea, goes from New Guinea to Southeast Asia, from Southeast Asia to South Asia, and that would be book 1. And book 2 would be how sugar introduced into the Mediterranean through the Middle East, and that would be book 2. And then book 3 would be from 16th century on, food, in this case, sugar in the Atlantic and in the New World. And I said, that's what I'm going to be working on. And I did that for 3 or 4 years. I don't know if Wendy, we met during that period of my life or not, but it was close in there when I was doing research at different places. And in the midst of this, Sid Mintz came out with the book Sweetness and Power. It is one of the books that's on your list. It's by far one of the best books, not in that case, excluding Wendy's book, which is better. So in this case, Sid Mintz's book came out, and I said, well, no publisher is going to take on a 3-volume work from an unknown person at that time who was writing a history of the world using sugar as a vehicle for this. So I would put aside my interest in sugar and work on other things. And that's how I got interested in food and started writing books on it and started teaching subjects related to that. But then I got around to the point of saying I had collected so much material, I wanted to write a book on sugar, and consequently, I'm going to run off. This is one of the shortest books I've ever written. So I just want you to know, 3 volumes down to about 15, 20,000 words, and that's the end of this. So I'm still in love with the subject, and I may take it on in a more important topic later on. Now, there are all sorts of sweeteners, and humankind has done everything they possibly can to get sweetness out of everything. And that includes, obviously, fruits. That includes vegetables. How many of you like carrots? Anybody carrots in here? Carrots are initially extremely bitter. It is only after hundreds of years of work with carrots that they, in fact, became sweet. How many of you are into insect products? Do we have anybody in here interested in? We only have one person interested. None of you are interested in honey? I'm shocked. So we've harvested the bee in order to produce sweetness. And we've harvested all sorts of other products and plants and saps from trees. Anybody into tree sap in here? I knew in Vermont I would get a hands up on that. There actually are many trees that have sweet saps at different times of the year, and only at certain times of the year does that sweetness make sense. And obviously, maple around here is one of those things that has been used as sweetener. So we have all sorts of sweeteners. And there's a pretty good reason for that. And the obvious reason is glucose. How many of you are into glucose? Any of you have some glucose on you? Glucose is the energy for your body. Without glucose, you're dead. By the way, your brain is the #1 need for the glucose. It consumes about 20 to 25% of the total glucose that you consume, in fact, goes into your brain. If your brain or any part of your brain does not have access to glucose for a matter of minutes, it dies. So consequently, glucose is crucial. No glucose, there is no life, at least not human life. And so consequently, it's something important. Lactose, by the way, is the 40% of breast milk, and that's one of the reasons on why that is. So there's a good reason on why humans need sweetness and why we have done everything we possibly can for the last several thousand years to figure out better ways of getting sweeter products. So that's part of this interesting thing. Now, from a natural standpoint, the one plant with the largest amount of sugar in it happens to be sucrose. Sucrose is also, you have some right back here, what is it also called? Table sugar. How many of you have had table sugar? All right, table sugar is sucrose. It consists of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. Fructose is easily metabolized by the body into glucose, but it is much sweeter than glucose is, and so consequently, that combination is what has interested humans for a long time. At least 10,000 years ago, there are people in New Guinea that decided that the sugar cane, in this case, what we'll call Creole sugar, is something that they want to tap into, and they have been, for at least several thousand years, they have been cultivating cane sugar in order to produce it. Cane sugar will not grow on its own. It will, if you just leave it out in the wild, it will die out. It needs humans to interact with it in order to plant it. It cannot be grown by its own, like corn, by the way. Corn cannot be grown without humans. So you have all sorts of things that have happened that make this something that is an important part of this. Now, here's the problem. As soon as have any of you been to Southeast Asia or South Asia and had some sugar cane cut up? You can get it, it's on the street, they sell it. And you usually chaw on it, or you can squeeze it out and get the juice out. Now, there's a problem with the juice of the sugar cane. As soon as you squeeze it out, what do you think is going to happen? How about fermentation? Is this something, if anyone interested in fermentation in here? Sugar cane is about 16 or 17% sugar, but it has a lot of impurities in it. As soon as you squeeze it out, it will begin to ferment, which is great if you want alcohol, but it's not great if you want to preserve the sweetness that is in there. So consequently, you have to figure out a way how to convert that juice that comes out into a solid product. We don't know for sure who first did that. The best evidence is people in India industrialized the process of making sugar, in this case, solid sugar out of cane sugar, and so cane sap. So in this case, you had a process of going on. Now, it's not like the granulated sugar. The granulated sugar that we know and love is a product of the 19th century. Prior to this time, it would have been extremely solid. You would have poured it into a mold when you got it down there, and typically it came in a cone shape, and so if you were wealthy enough to be able to afford some of the sugar, you would come along and scrape it off. Now, it would not have been white. White sugar is also a creation of the 19th century because it would have had impurities in it. It would have been gray or had other colors in it besides simply the white that we know and love in our sugar cane. So consequently, this becomes an important product in India. Once you solidify it, then you can trade it. You can't trade the juice, but you can trade the hard product. And so from India, it goes, the sugar trade will go into China. China will begin to adopt sugar cane, at least in the south part of China. You will begin to have early records of Chinese consuming sugar. There are sugar places that you can actually buy sugar in China by the 12th century, etc. So it becomes an important product there. The Greeks and Romans were familiar with sugar. They called it the reed that made honey, and consequently, it is the Greeks and the Romans that will do some importation of sugar into the Mediterranean in ancient times. Now, here's the problem. There's not a lot of it. And why would Romans want sugar besides the fact that they might have liked the taste of it? It's an important part of it's medicinal. It's an important part of medicine. How many of you know Mary Poppins? A little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down. Can we all sing this for a little while here? And that's exactly the way it was used, because many of the medicines of from the last for 1,500 years were in fact bitter. You would then put a little sugar to it, so it made it much easier for people to consume. So at least from about the 1st century all the way through the 15th century, this was an important use for the sugar that we would have had made during this time. So sugar goes from India into first the Middle East. It is Egypt that is a major sugar producer. It goes from the Middle East into the Mediterranean, particularly for the islands in the Mediterranean will become extremely important sugar producers. Sicily is an important sugar producer. Anybody been to Sicily? We have a couple people with their hands up. It is not what you think of as the agricultural center of the world today, mainly because of sugar. Cane industry destroyed the land that was historically a rich agricultural area, and it did the same thing to many of the other islands. Now, one of the reasons on the Mediterranean that was extremely important was the rise of a single city called Venice. Anybody been to Venice? You got to go to Venice if you haven't been there. Venice reason on why it will rise in power is because of the sugar industry. It will control the islands, many of the islands that are in the Mediterranean. It will take in all the sugar. It will convert the sugar into a refined product, and from Venice, it will go into the rest of Europe. Now, there's a problem if you're on the western end of Europe, and that is you can see the sugar. You can see who gets rich. It's the Venetians. You can see who gets poor, and that's those in France, England, and in northern Europe. And so those areas decide there must be a better way to get sugar other than buying it from the Venetians. And so one of the things that they begin to do is explore the Atlantic islands. In this case, the Canary Islands, the Azores, etc. And they conclude that these are really good places to grow sugar. By the way, sugar cane is not particularly a product that is successful in the Mediterranean, and the reason is if you have one cold spell, the sugar will die or will stop producing, and so consequently it's not perfect. But the islands in the Atlantic are better, but there's a problem. Nobody on those islands wants to engage in sugar production. Anybody in here interested in sugar production? This has been a problem with sugar production for at least the last 2,000 years. Nobody wants to do this. And so you use slaves for this. Now, initially, by the way, the slaves are not from Africa. The slaves, in fact, you go to war. You don't go to war to conquer territory. You go to war to conquer people. You bring the people back in as slaves, and therefore they're the ones that will engage in this industry. So that's the problem you have from the beginning, slavery introduced into the sugar trade. So when you go into the Atlantic islands, you need to import slaves. In this case, most of the slaves will be imported from West Africa. So, and as Christopher Columbus, by the way, he marries a woman from one of the islands in the Atlantic. Her father just happens to be a governor of the island, which is a major sugar producer. When he takes his second trip to the New World, he will bring sugar cane with him and will introduce it into what is today Haiti. So you have this introduction from the islands into the Caribbean. And it takes off at this point in the Caribbean and in Brazil. So you've got major production of sugar going on, and now you have new producers for sugar, and that's it. Now, sugar is not just associated with slavery. It is also associated with wealth. If you had wealth, you demonstrated it. How would you demonstrate your wealth with sugar? I'm sorry? Well, we'll talk about chocolate in a second. We haven't got the chocolate yet, but we will get there. All right, anybody else? How would you demonstrate your wealth? Well, you can serve it, okay, but why not make some sculptures out of it? How many want to make some sculptures with your sugar? You're laughing. For at least 2,000 years, people have made sculptures from sugar. And so It is a way you just pour it into your mold. Rather than coming out a cone, you will come out with, and they're literally some of the feasts in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of these molds. And then as the guests would leave, you would give them one of these sculptures, or if you wanted to use it, you would, of course, scrape it off and you could use it as well. So this is how you demonstrated your wealth. If indeed you had sugar and you had sugar cane, this was one of the ways that you could demonstrate how powerful you were, how wealthy you were, that you could give this most important and expensive product away. So that's one of the things that you could do with sugar in order to demonstrate the position that you had within your society. Now, as sugar cane increased in terms of places, then you had refining issues, and refining sugar is not an easy thing. One of the things that's left over in the early process of refining sugar, anyone know the product that is not used, was totally used, it was tossed out to begin with? It's called molasses. Anybody ever hear of molasses? Now today, by the way, I just want you to know, most of the molasses, they make refined sugar to begin with, and then they convert it into molasses, as opposed to trying to have this as a product that they use for other purposes. So for most of the sugar industry in the Caribbean, you had this junk left over, which is all that excess stuff that you just typically dumped into the ocean. Americans had a good alternative use for this. Anybody know what you could do with molasses? Yes? Well, the first thing is you can use it as a sweetener, and at least for colonial times, it would have been what most Americans would have used. They would have used molasses as a sweetener because they would not have been able to afford pure sugar. But the second thing they could do with it, they could make rum. Now, here's part of the problem. You have British islands in the Caribbean, and you have French and you have Dutch islands in the Caribbean. They're all making sugar. The French don't want molasses introduced into France. Why wouldn't they want molasses introduced into France? There's a brandy industry in France which says we don't want molasses introduced because we don't want rum in France. And as far as I could tell, rum was not a product that was made in France until relatively recently. So you had control of this industry that's going on, and you had the brandy industry that was coming along. So these poor French islands in the Caribbean have a lot of junk left over. What are you going to do with it? You could throw it away, or you could sell it to the Americans. How many of you think selling it to the Americans would be a good idea? The British didn't like this idea of buying this molasses product because they believed in mercantilism, and mercantilism meant you traded everything through England. You didn't go to French colonies and pick the stuff up. And so in the 1730s, they passed the Molasses Act, which taxed buying molasses from French or non-British islands. Anybody ever hear of taxation without representation? No one in America cared about taxation and representation in the 1730s, and the reason was twofold. First, the British did not enforce it, and so therefore there was a great deal of smuggling going on. I know this will shock you, but some of those who signed the Declaration of Independence just happened to be smugglers of molasses coming in. And if there's no enforcement going on, all you got to do is, even if you want to import it directly, say, into Boston, then all you really had to do is pay off the guy who was coming in or keep him friends. And so lots of ways of getting about this. You have the French and Indian War that comes along in the 1760s. It is the British that win. And so the French are now kicked out of North America. There is no longer French Canada. It's now occupied by England. And there's no longer what is now those areas that is west of the Alleghenies are no longer controlled by the French and the Indians, but now are British territory. The British think that the Americans should help pay the cost of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in America. And they think that Americans should help pay the cost of garrisoning this space because you got to control the Indians. Is that a good idea? So they decide they're going to pass the Sugar Act, and the Sugar Act is what they're going to tax Americans, but this time, unlike the Molasses Act, they're going to enforce it. So they send the British fleet over to America to make sure the smuggling stops. How many of you think this is a good idea? Those in Boston did not think this is a good idea, and where they did not complain about the Molasses Act and the tax, they now complained about the sugar tax, and there is where you ended up with no taxation without representation, and the American Revolution will be an end product of this coming along. So we can talk at length about that if you want, but that's part of this. Now, it just so happens the Americans win the revolution. Is this a surprise? The Green Mountain Boys did something with that. In Ticonderoga, I don't know. There's a German by the name of Wilhelm Havemeyer Wilhelm is an immigrant. He goes into London. He's now become William. Does that sound like a good idea? And he is apprenticed to a sugar refinery in London. He decides that London's not the place for him, that the real place for him is New York City. Anybody from New York City in here besides? There's two of us, okay, three of us, okay. So he then travels to New York City. He becomes a manager for a sugar refinery that is there. He then moves from the sugar refinery. He, with his other family members who have immigrated in, he will open up his own for refinery itself. By the 1840s, he will have the largest technological sugar refinery in the world that is constructed in Williamsburg, and the remains of it are still there. And I think the Domino sugar design at least is still up there. So this is an important part. Now, I mentioned slavery to begin with. Along came a man by the name of Adam Smith. He's not a relative. Anybody know Adam Smith? He wrote a book, the short title of which is The Wealth of Nations. He publishes this in 1776. It is the beginning of capitalism, the end of mercantilism, and his capitalist view is as follows. Slavery is not just morally reprehensible. Slavery is wrong because it's inefficient. And if you get rid of slavery, you will improve your technology, and the technology will make it so that slavery is unnecessary. And indeed, as the British end slavery in the 1830s, that is exactly what happens in the Caribbean. So you move from first a slave-based system into a worker-based system, and from a worker-based system, everyone sits down and says, how can we improve technology so that we can increase the amount of sugar and decrease the cost? So the price of sugar decreases after slavery ends. Sugar industry expands, and you have, in fact, the cost of sugar decreases appreciably. So if the problem in the sugar price declines appreciably, you've got a real problem with the industry because you can't make any money if the cost goes down so far. So there's a good solution to this. And what's the solution? Let's form a sugar trust. Is that a good idea? In this way, we can buy up all of the sugar. We can control the price. And the control of sugar price, by the way, remains today. It is not just something of the 19th century, although it's controlled in different ways. So the problem is the cost of sugar is virtually nothing. And so what you pay for it, it really is supporting all of the people in industry and advertising and promotion and lots of other reasons in there. And the sugar trust will be, and I know I'll probably get this, I'll say this wrong, but Henry Osborne Havemeyer was the one who created the Sugar Trust in 1877, and at least for the next 50 years it will maintain the cost of sugar, and it does so indirectly after that period of time. He will have a granddaughter. The granddaughter is Electra Havemeyer Webb, who will create this institution here. And by the way, this is my first trip here. Is anybody else the first trip here to this? Just the out-of-towners. This is an incredible place. One of the places that the Havemeyers had was a beautiful home in Manhattan, and it has been reconstructed on the insides of it, and this next door to us, with much of their artworks that they had in it in Manhattan that they have been introduced over here. So I'm looking, I haven't been there yet. That's one of the things I want to do today, so that's on my list. So it's wonderful that that's the case. So we have this industry coming along. Now, sugar, as the price drops, it's added to everything. Everything that you can think of, sugar is in one form or another. How about French fry? Any of you like French fries in here? I like French fries. Anybody in here? If you go to McDonald's, it will have sugar on it. Why will it have sugar on it? And the answer is there's such a thing as the bliss point. Anybody into bliss points? Bliss points will be the point in which you will like the taste of something. So in this case, you add sugar and salt together, will give you a flavor that is better for your taste buds than anything else. So how about let's create some health foods. And the health food industry, like Kellogg's, for instance, sugar, and there's a cereal industry. Any of you into cereal in here? It's a health food. It's a way to help Americans become vegetarians. Any of you vegetarians, you're laughing at this. I'm not. This is serious. Get them off of eggs, get them off of bacon, get them off. I mean, breakfast used to be a big deal, and it would have all these things. So we're going to create a cereal. And the cereal, we're going to create its way to get around and convince Americans not to consume. By the way, typically in the real old days with the Kellogg Institute, it would have been consumed with water, not milk. And so they go commercial, and they start making some money selling this vegetarian health food. Does that sound like a good idea? Now, there's a problem. A lot of kids don't like it. And so what's the solution? How about putting a little sugar on it to help the cereal go down? Is that something, good idea? Okay, so we've got some sugar added to it, we've got a little sweetener added to it, and that's great. But if you add a little more, your sales increase more. Does that sound like a good idea now? And if we add a little more sugar, the sales increase even more. At one point in the 1950s, there was one cereal with 72% sugar. And some of the top-selling cereals today, they have decreased it, but the amount of sugar that was contained in them was in the 40s and 50%. So all I can do is say the amount of sugar that goes into virtually every product, every processed product that you consume is there. Now, I know you didn't want me to talk at length about obesity, so I won't do it, other than to mention that there was a report that came out on Friday. Obesity in America has hit its highest point at 40% of the American population is now defined as obese. So, and it's not just sugar, but sugar is a major component of that, and so we all like it. Now, I personally don't like to call that fat. I just want you to know I call it energy storage. It's energy storage, in this case, is glucose that is ready to be used in case I do a little running or jogging. I want to have that energy stored up so I can use it. But that's one of the problems of a tremendous success story, and that's it. Now, we have a presentation on chocolate later on. Chocolate is I look forward to your presentation. I don't want to, I just give a couple brief comments on it. Chocolate is a new world product. It will be a product that is from Maya and Aztecs, and they will consume it as a froth. It will, just for your information, it typically would have had chili peppers in it. It may have had bee honey. The bees in the New World don't produce as much honey as the Italian bee, which we now have around us today. There is no, in North America, there are no sweeteners, there's no bees, there's nothing obvious as sweetener except for some saps and things like that. But in this case, they might have put it in there, and it would be consumed typically by the emperors of the Aztecs. And anyone know why they would consume it? It's an aphrodisiac. Does that sound like a good idea? Now, you're laughing at this. This is not something to laugh at. This notion of the relationship between sugar and chocolate and aphrodisiacs continue to our Valentine's Day. So you're laughing at this, but I can show you the advertising and the promotion. You can improve your love life by giving a little chocolate. Have I tried that? I've tried that. So all I can do is say there's massive ways of doing this. I can talk for hours on this subject. I loved writing this book. I will probably write more books on sugar and sweets, and I look forward to the other presentations. Is there time for questions or not? Okay, I'm more than willing. No questions? I can lecture more. I've got a couple hours, yeah. Yes? The cost of sugar, the price of sugar going down is improved technology. So the answer is it's a labor-intensive activity to begin with of planting the cane, of harvesting the cane, of processing the cane and converting it from juice into a solid. And if you improve the process of taking it down to begin with, so that there are now cane cutters that will come along and it's actually done mechanically, then you'll remove the need for labor, and if you reduce the amount of labor that's involved in that, you reduce the cost of the sugar. So that's it. It will be a while before all of that is technologically improved, but today it's a labor, labor has very little to do with the whole thing. So from the beginning of the planting until the harvesting, till the converting in, it's all done mechanically. And that's true not just of sugar, by the way, that's true of virtually all of our industrial agricultural system. We can all complain about it, but it is what has created a system which is the cheapest food in America. Anybody know how much Americans spent on food in 1900? 48% of their take-home pay was expended on food in 1900. Anyone know what Americans spend today? It's less than 10% of the amount of your take-home pay is spent on food. So part of the problem is that our devaluation of food, meaning when it's expensive, we treated it like royalty. And when it's not expensive, we tend to ignore it and throw it out. Somebody should write a good book on food waste. That's my next book. I thought I'd mention this. Okay, does that answer your question? If I don't answer your question, just tell me I didn't do it. All right, anybody else? I go off on these tangents. Nothing? Yes, please.
How is sugarcane reproduced? And also, could you expand on how
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the first part of the question.
how is sugarcane reproduced, or is it
Yes.
maintained?
Yes.
And how does it desolate the environment, as you mentioned in Sicily?
Okay, sugarcane is a bamboo-like product, and during its growing season, it can typically grow 2 inches a day. It can be 2 to 4 inches around. It can grow 18 to 20 feet high under perfect climatic conditions. So that's it. As you look at the cane, you will see that there are nods, and as you go up it, there is a little eye in the middle of each nod, so there may be 10 or 15 nods that are there. In order to grow sugarcane, you have to chop off each of the things with a nod in the middle. You have to take that nod and you have to put the nod in the ground. If the whole thing falls over, it will not reproduce. And so consequently, humans have to cut it up and have to, initially had to cut it up themselves and then put it in. Today it's all done mechanically, but that is exactly how we would grow it. Without that, and the same thing with corn. If you think your corn that you grow in your garden will grow again, all I could do is say, let your corn die, and see what happens. And the answer is, it may grow back for 1 season, it will not grow back for 2. And it has human interaction. Humans have interacted with agricultural world in order to create the products that we know, love, and consume. And it is these things that are absolutely necessary for a human involvement in order to create a product that is... And sugarcane has about 17% sweetener in it. It is the largest natural source of sugar plant, and so that is the high product. I don't mind talking about high fructose corn syrup. I don't mind talking about the other sugars. I focused on that for reasons. Yes, please?
Where do sugar beets come into this system?
Where does sugar what?
Beets. Sugar beets.
Oh, good question. There's a real problem if you're in Northern Europe, and that is sugarcane doesn't grow there. And if you're in Russia and Germany, you don't have easy access like France, Spain, Portugal, and England to the Atlantic. And so therefore, you're not going to want to buy sugar. Remember, mercantilism, if you buy sugar, you're going to have to give up gold or silver historically, and they didn't really want to do that, and so they started exploring other sources. And it is Napoleon. Everybody remembers Napoleon in here. He will say, there's a product, because those British have blockaded the French off and on from the 1780s through 1815, and they've cut off the sugar from these islands, and the French want sugar, and so therefore he starts investing in sugar cane production, sugar beet production, and sugar beets begin to become productive. Today, sugar beets are grown extensively in Northern Europe, where sugarcane can't grow, and they're grown extensively in the United States. It is, from a standpoint of economics, it is inefficient to grow sugar beets, meaning the following: it is more costly to grow sugar beets and produce sugar out of it than it is to grow cane. And so why do you have sugar beet production? And the answer is politics and tariffs and controls that are currently in our culinary system that prevent imports from coming in. If we did, in fact, ever really carry out NAFTA and gave Mexico total ability to import sugar, which it can do from the southern part of it, there would be no sugar industry in America. In Florida, there would be no sugar beet industry in the West, simply because of the low cost, of ease of making sugar in certain places, and the high cost of trying to make sugar in Florida, which is not ideal, or creating sugar beets in the West. So politics is the reason for that surviving today. It has nothing to do with economics.
Andy, as a follow-up, so where is sugarcane grown today?
Oh, sugarcane, the largest sugarcane producer is Brazil, and that brings up issues which have been raised extensively by environmentalists. Obviously, you can grow sugarcane constantly in Brazil, and one way you do it is by removing the jungle, and vast tracts of Brazil have done that. Likewise, similar things have happened in Central America. Sugarcane is sugar is produced in the Caribbean, but not a lot today. It is also produced in India and can be produced in other countries, but the largest producer by far is Brazil. We have two questions. What happened?
You mentioned in Sicily that the agricultural lands were ruined by sugarcane. Is that?
Yes.
How does that happen?
It happens because if you grow a single product on land for years and years and years, it destroys the land so that it becomes unproductive. In this case, in Sicily and virtually all of the other Mediterranean islands where sugarcane was produced, what would happen is they kept growing it, they kept planting it, and then when you had rains that would come through, you began to have massive amounts of erosion. So Sicily's agriculture was destroyed by erosion, dealing with products like repeating the same product growing on the same land over and over again. So that is a major cause, and that's a concern today with the new lands that are being, you begin to have production there too, so it's a problem, yeah.
So what about stevia, which is now, sold as an alternative sweetener in health food stores?
There's a whole, there's a lot of different health issues that are related to stevia now. I just noticed that the new Coca-Cola Zero now has stevia in it, which was surprising to me. I don't particularly like the taste of it, but that's another matter. I mean, the goal is what you want to do is create an alternative that will make you feel good because you tasted something that's sweet and at the same time doesn't make you fat. And so that's the product. By far the most important early product was saccharin. And saccharin was, the major producer was Monsanto. Anybody here ever hear of Monsanto? And Monsanto, I mean, the initial goal was simply to make it available to diabetics so that you could consume something that was sweet without having to consume sugar. And so it is only after World War II when concern in America moves to obesity and diabetes and with other potentially related health problems that you begin to look at alternatives. And so there's a number of alternatives that come in, of which stevia would be one later on. I have not looked at the latest research on that. I'm always worried that taking something that tells your body you're going to get a sweetener and then it doesn't arrive is something else. When you have 10,000 taste buds in your mouth, every single one has a sweet receptor. And it's instant that that sweet receptor fires off, it tells the brain, the exact same part of the brain, by the way, it's the reward center. None of you drink, I know, but if you did drink, that would be the reward center. None of you do drugs. If you did, that would be the reward center, and other things that we have. The reward center then tells the stomach that it's time now to eat and you need to become efficient. And so at least there's been some question about all of the sugar alternatives, whether or not it makes our bodies more efficient so the food that you do consume along with it, it is more productive in terms of taking the calories out of that, breaking down carbohydrates into glucose, and the glucose is not, if it's not used, it will be stored, and that ends up as fat. So there are issues. I'm not up on the latest issue with that. There seems to be some positive statements about stevia too, so that's it.
So
Nobody mentioned high fructose corn syrup. Anybody into high fructose corn syrup? Anybody against high fructose corn syrup? Anybody not want to make a stand on high fructose corn syrup? We have one person are you favor or opposed?
I'm opposed.
Are you opposed? Okay. I will give my opinion and then I will leave quickly and get out of the room. Sucrose is 50% glucose and it is 50% fructose. That is what it is. The instant that it goes into your body, the glucose is separated from the fructose instantaneous, within a matter of not even a second. The glucose will enter your bloodstream immediately. The fructose will go and will be metabolized into glucose and will go in. So that is what sucrose is, and 50-50. High fructose corn syrup, by definition, must be less than 60% fructose, period. So most of the high fructose corn syrup is like 44% glucose and 56% fructose. The reason on why they do it, it's sweeter. So if you're making beverages, for instance, it will taste much sweeter than will sugarcane. So that's it. Would the high fructose corn syrup industry survive if there were total importation of sucrose from other countries or sugarcane from other countries? And the answer is no, because it costs more to produce it than it does to produce sugarcane in Brazil and import it into the United States. So the quick answer, from a health standpoint, in my humble opinion, there is no evidence that high fructose corn syrup is any worse than sucrose. Now I can see nobody wants to ask me any more questions.
Yeah, well, perhaps after lunch, when people are recharged for the afternoon Q&A, you can think about your attitude towards fructose. Andy, thank you very much.